Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Boxer, members of the UCLA community, whenever I come to UCLA, I am at home. And I therefore especially appreciate the invitation from Mr. David Lawton, who was then student chairman of the Distinguished Speakers Program, who's now been succeeded by Mr. Joe Boxer, that brings me here this noon. In June of this year, it will be 38 years since my graduation from this institution in the class of 27. That was on the old Vermont Avenue campus. This huge Westwood campus was only an idea at that time. But just how long ago that really was is perhaps best measured by the fact that a guy of my size, and I was even smaller then, could play on the UCLA basketball team, as I did. And we won championships then, too. The competition perhaps was a little less stiff than Johnny Wooden's boys, just superb boys meet today. But we were playing against Oxy and Pomona, Redlands, Whittier, Caltech, but now and then against Berkeley, Stanford, and other Pacific big-time schools also. Indeed, I may say that one of my outstanding distinctions at that time, back there in those days, was to have been knocked cold on the Stanford Pavilion by the great Ernie Nevers, a 210-pound Irishman who could do the 100 yards in 10 flat. And he was doing that speed when he hit me. Just before coming in here, I met for the first time Coach John Wooden, and I was tremendously impressed by him. He's certainly a great person, a great leader, and a great coach. Well, now, my feelings of belonging to this academic community are just as strong now as they were on my graduation day, maybe even stronger. And my sense of gratitude to the university for the invaluable assistance it gave me toward making my way in a highly competitive world is greater than ever today. But enough of that. I certainly didn't come out here from New York to talk about myself. In fact, Mr. Lawton left the subject of my talk entirely to me, and I intend to take full advantage of that freedom to ramble a bit for the next 40 minutes or so about some current dangers and also some hopes as I see them from, shall we say, Vietnam to Selma, with some way stops in between. But I trust you will pardon me if I first make some brief personal references, less to myself than to my career, and I have a purpose in doing that. I should say perhaps careers, because I've had two, one as a professor and the other in public service. Now, it may be that some of you, I'd be surprised if this were not the case, may be as undecided about your future as I was at your stage in life back in 1927. And if so, my advice is that your main objective should be to continue your education just as far as you can in some direction. The exact direction does, in my view, not make a whole lot of difference, but in some direction. I had no firm idea, even at graduation, as to what I wanted to be or to do. In truth, that's been true more or less throughout my entire career. There was never any planning, and so far as I can recall, there was never any real aspiring. I only sort of fell into what came naturally. In June 1927, however, because my intellectual curiosity had been whetted and stimulated in 4 UCLA years, I wanted to continue my education somewhere in some direction. And that proved to be quite enough. I recall with nostalgia the advice I was given by one of the great deans in the early years of this university, Dean Reber. And he was saying that since I would probably become a lawyer, go into the study of law, I should go to the beach. I should lie on the sand and read poetry there. And he said this would mellow my soul. Well, I was always obedient as a student, and I obeyed the dean. And I enjoyed it, enjoyed the devil out of it, as a matter of fact. I do not know if my soul mellowed any, but I sure caught up on some needed sleep. With the inducement of a fellowship, I then went east to pursue graduate studies and degrees, and before I knew it, I was teaching in college at Howard University in Washington, D.C. It was a good life teaching, very rewarding in many ways, although not, at least in those days, financially rewarding. In that regard, I can't help but recall an experience I had with another dean, the Dean of Liberal Arts at Howard University in my early teaching days. I had started work there at a munificent salary of $1,500 per year, and so I was seeing the dean regularly asking for a raise, and particularly so after I got married and children were on the way. And so I'd go in regularly, and he would always soothe me by saying, don't hurry, don't be impatient, you've got good training, you've got good material, you'll make your way and your day will come, and so on. And the last couple of times I'd been in there, he had told me, well, after all, just think of what my situation was when I was at your stage. He said at that time I was only making $500 per year. Well, on this particular day I had just learned that our second child was coming, and I was not much in the mood for being tolerant about these questions. And so when the dean said to me about the $500 that he had been earning at my stage, I told him, well, Mr. Dean, I've concluded that that's irrelevant, because I'm quite sure now that that was all you were worth. Those of you who are going into teaching may bear that in mind. I don't commend it as the way to win friends and influence deans. On those days also, I must say that when I first began teaching, and I'm ashamed to tell this because I've told it so many times, but I have a special purpose for telling it today. I had been imbued with academic integrity in my graduate work. Howard was a coeducational school like UCLA, and I was quite prepared when at the end of one term one of the co-eds, who I had noticed was not the least attractive co-ed in the class. Teachers do notice those things, even though you might not suspect it. She came up with her blue books and her term papers and all this business, and the big argument, saying that she deserved more than the B I had given her. Well, I stood my ground. I did not change that grade. It remains on the registrar's rolls at Howard University today as a B. But on June 23rd of this year, Mrs. Bunche and I will be celebrating our 35th wedding anniversary. And she's in the audience here somewhere, and I know I have to add, having said this, otherwise I'll hear about it afterwards, that there have been a number of occasions, maybe a good many in those 35 years, when she has expressed sorrow at ever having raised the question of that grade. Teaching was broadening for me. There was travel for research in Africa, the Far East, and Europe, and the American South. I was sort of a young Turk on the Howard campus, leading movements against the administration and so on. And so I never had any difficulty in getting leave. I was connected with the university 18 years and taught 7. And whenever I couldn't think of any reason for going on leave, I usually had a suggestion from the president or the dean. Well, this led me into war work in the government. Beginning in 1941, because of my travel and field experience, I was called into the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, in that cloak and dagger organization. It was headed by General Wild Bill Donovan, William Donovan, and he had the unique idea of putting professors in the front lines in wartime as intelligence teams. Many students might endorse this idea enthusiastically. I know most of mine did. In OSS, I worked as an expert on Africa and Southeast Asia. But even before Pearl Harbor, I was doing work for military intelligence, which was G2, on landings in North Africa. And it was at that time, in the early fall of 1941, that I first met our present Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. He was then Captain Rusk. He was working in G2 on Southeast Asia. Dean Rusk is a native of Georgia, has an unmistakable Georgian accent. And so it impressed me when one evening around 7 o'clock he came into my cubicle and said, "Are you working late tonight?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, so am I. Let's go and get dinner." And I hesitated. I said, "Where?" Because this was in the old munitions building in Washington, and the munitions building had a notorious lily-white officers' mess. No Negro who wasn't waiting table could put foot in that mess. And so when that was so it made an impact on me when I said where, and Dean Rusk said, "Well, at the mess." And because I was sure he knew the situation, and so I said okay, and I followed him down there, and this Georgian captain, with me trailing along behind him, walked into this full mess. The place was packed, and all of a sudden you could hear a pin drop. There wasn't a sound. There was no cutlery, there were no dishes, nobody was eating, everybody was looking. We walked up to the counter, we got our food, he found a place, we sat down, and from that evening on, the officers' mess at the munitions building in Washington was integrated, simply by this simple act of Dean Rusk from Georgia. Well, subsequently I was transferred to the State Department in 1944, when preliminary work began on planning for the UN. There had never been a Negro desk officer in the State Department. This was 1944. There had never been a Negro desk officer in that department before then. And there was consequently a considerable delay in processing my transfer. Bureaucracies, governmental, educational, all of them invariably resist change. And this was certainly true of the State Department in 1944. And this was brought to the attention of the then Secretary of State, who was a Southerner, Cordell Hull. And I was told later that Cordell Hull, when the issue came to him, said, "Is the man qualified?" He was informed, "Yes, he's qualified." "Well, then appoint him," he said, and that was the end of it, and I was immediately cleared. Well, on the formation of the United Nations in 46, the State Department loaned me to the United Nations for 3 months, sort of like a professional athlete, and after several extensions of the loan, I decided to stay on the international side, resigned from the U.S. government service, and also from Howard University, from which I was on leave. And from then on, my career was at the UN. First in the work of trusteeship in non-self-governing territories, And in this regard, I must say that one of the most significant developments of our time, and one of the developments that has most amazed me in terms of its pace, has been what has happened in this field of non-self-governing territories, of colonial peoples. When the United Nations came into being in 1946, there were in this world 800 million colonial people, people being ruled by other people, usually of a different race, without their consent. That figure is now substantially below 100 million, so that we've had almost 800 million people in the course of a score of years who have marched into freedom and independence, marking, in my view, the greatest, the most inspiring chapter in the history of freedom in all the chronicles of mankind. Well, from trusteeship of non-self-governing territories, I went to Palestine in 1947 to 49. I was with the Palestine Special Committee, the one that recommended partition, and I must say at that time I sort of worked on both sides of the street, because I worked with the majority of the committee on the majority report which recommended partition, and I also helped draft the minority report which recommended federation. But the Assembly adopted the majority report. In May of 1948, I had perhaps what was the most single significant assignment in my whole career, because of my work in Palestine in 47, Trygve Lie, who was then Secretary General of the UN, sent me to Paris to meet Count Fulk Bernadotte, who had just been appointed Palestine mediator to mediate the Palestine War, and who was on his way to Palestine. He'd never been to the UN, and he'd never been to Palestine, and so Lee wanted someone who knew something about those two areas to be with him. And so I met him, a stern man of military bearing, the title of Count, and I'd never met a Count before and was sort of scared of the title. And I met him at Le Bourget airfield in Paris. And I came up to him, introduced myself, and he nodded stiffly but courteously. And the next words he said to me, and what am I to do in Palestine? And that sort of stumped me, but I said, sir, as I understand it, you are to go out there and stop the Arabs and Jews from fighting. And he didn't blink, and he said, with what? And then I thought I was quite richly diplomatic, and I said, with your great wisdom, sir. And then he said to me, and who is to help me? And I whispered, me. And he grunted and said, oh, I see, and turned away. But he went out there, and within a few weeks of going out there, in one of the greatest feats of negotiation in the whole history of diplomacy, Bernadotte had a temporary ceasefire, which was later succeeded by an indefinite ceasefire in the war between the Arabs and the Jews. Since 1956, I had a short period of work on peaceful uses of atomic energy, which was extremely interesting. And since 56, I've been responsible for all of the United Nations peacekeeping operations, the UN military observers and the peace armies. And as Undersecretary for Special Political Affairs, I work directly with the Secretary General on these operations and on many political problems as they arise in the Near East, in Africa, or Southeast Asia, such as now Vietnam. So, I stand before you as a member of the United Nations Secretariat, an international civil servant, a career man of 20 years in international service. And now I have said this much about my activities to make these 3 points. First, I had no special training for or knowledge about the work on any of these UN assignments except my first, in trusteeship in non-self-governing territories. But with a good and broad education, I did not hesitate to undertake any of them. Secondly, there was no training or deliberate preparation for such a career. In my experience, I have found that the decisive factor is to be ready and willing to take an opportunity and meet a challenge whenever it is presented. In this regard, I owe everything except my ability to work very hard and to sweat things out to UCLA and to my subsequent graduate studies. And thirdly, the international field, whether in national or international employment, affords increasing opportunity for well-trained people, whatever their area of concentration. International work, I can assure you, is very interesting. It can be exciting at times, but it can also be very frustrating. There are so many missed opportunities, or opportunities that one sees that could be taken but are missed. Well, enough about careers, whether yours or mine, except that what I shall discuss in the remaining minutes has a vital bearing on the future of all careers. For unless the peace of the world can be preserved, unless the holocaust of nuclear war can be averted, there will be no future for anyone. And I'll talk now about certain aspects of our contemporary world. And in doing so, I claim no special authority, no knowledge or wisdom other than the perspective afforded by association with the United Nations. It's a tense world we live in today. It's insecure, and at the moment it's under new threats of danger. Actually, it's not easy for me to make such a statement, for I am a dyed-in-the-wool optimist, and congenitally I always seek and usually find a bright side in the darkest situation. But given the peril of escalating war implicit in the Vietnam conflict, the deteriorating relations between West and East, the ominous attitudes of Communist China, and the paralyzing crisis which has gripped the General Assembly of the United Nations since last December, I am anything but cheerful. Still, despite the danger, the worst thing any of us could do for our future would be to become resigned to the inevitability of world war, of nuclear war, of the end of the UN, and the coming of doom. It's particularly in times such as these, however grim the outlook, that it is imperative for people everywhere to maintain a sense of balance, to view alarming events from a broad perspective and with understanding patience, to hold to a firm faith in man and in his ultimate good sense, if not his goodness, to have the courage to stand up for peace and to stand up for the right, and to retain the ability to hope and even to laugh, even if on occasion only dark laughter may seem possible. And now let me say a few words about one of these dangers, Vietnam. It's certainly cause for the deepest concern. The United States, or the UN is not involved directly, but for months now, the Secretary General of the UN, U Thant, has been working intensively behind the scenes to find a path to peace. He's not had very much cooperation or encouragement, I may say. The United States, our country, is alone in the commitment to protect the independence of South Vietnam, and this is no enviable position. There has been a steady escalation in recent months of the war north of the 17th parallel. There has been a deeper and deeper United States military involvement. Ever more Marines and aircraft are being sent. But to what end? A solid military victory for the United States? Very few would believe that likely. The world well knows the United States military strength, and there's no need to demonstrate that. And so, one, it seems to me, reaches the inevitable conclusion that negotiation is the only sensible goal and course to follow with regard to Vietnam. It takes two to negotiate, of course. And the big question is this: is Hanoi likely to be responsive to negotiation under the intimidation of daily United States air raids? It was for this reason that Prime Minister Pearson made his recent appeal in Philadelphia for a moratorium on United States airstrikes. It's not pleasant to contemplate that war in Vietnam might grow into something like the Korean War, with hordes of Chinese communist volunteers deployed as fighters in Vietnam. President Johnson, in his speech at Johns Hopkins last month, or earlier this month, made two especially welcome statements of U.S. policy: the appeal for a massive, expanded collective economic development plan for the Southeast Asian countries in the Mekong River area, and an expression of the readiness of the United States to enter into unconditional discussions seeking a peaceful settlement of the Vietnam conflict. But of course, the continuing airstrikes inevitably affect both of these statements in their application. Hanoi, North Vietnam, through the statement of their Premier Dong, has indicated a willingness to negotiate, but only under certain severe conditions. Now, since it is not clearly apparent what our air raids are now accomplishing, or indeed what they ultimately aim to accomplish, the question, as you know, is being increasingly asked why these air raids could not be suspended, at least for a while. The latest to suggest a pause in the air strikes is Senator Fulbright. I am bound to say in all frankness that it is difficult for me to see what could be lost by a pause in the airstrikes, while it is at least conceivable that something important and constructive could be gained from such a pause. The strikes, of course, could always be resumed if necessary. We can realize, surely, that it is difficult, even for a small and weak country like North Vietnam, to enter into talks under the pressure of daily bombings. Perhaps as the next step, the United States could announce that as soon as there was agreement to enter into talks, the air raids would be suspended. After all, the stakes are very high. They may be no less than the peace of this world. Now, what about another danger to the future? The acute crisis besetting the United Nations. One must be quite frank about this. The plain fact is that since last December, the United Nations has been experiencing the gravest difficulty in the almost 20 years of its existence. There is no threat to the actual existence of the organization, although some claim there is, but I believe that the UN has reached a crucial crossroad, and its future nature and effectiveness are very much at stake. Let me emphasize that the issue goes much deeper than the application of Article 19 of the UN Charter, the question of unpaid dues. This article, as you know, would deprive of their votes in the General Assembly those nations, most notably France and the Soviet Union, but 9 others also, which have become 2 years in arrears in the payment of their assessments, regular and special, to the United Nations. But what is really involved is only the payments on the special assessments. And there have been only 2 special assessments for 2 of the peacekeeping operations. And the first of these was the UN Emergency Force in Gaza and Sinai, which began in 1956 and is still a peace force out there, and the most expensive of all UN peacekeeping operations, the Congo, which is now finished. The problem, I say, has to do with much more than money, seriously short of money though the United Nations is. In fact, this money crisis could be settled by an amount of $20 million, which is no staggering sum. The underlying issue concerns the kind of organization the United Nations of the future is going to be. Whether it is to be both a forum and a dynamic instrument for protecting the peace of the world, as well as talking about it, or primarily a talking body. And involved in this question also is the issue of whether the Security Council, in which the 5 big powers have the veto, should regain its original supremacy in matters of peace and security over the General Assembly, in which all 114 members of the United Nations are on the equal footing of one country, one vote. This obviously and primarily affects the future role of the United Nations in peacemaking and peacekeeping, which is precisely the area in which the organization has succeeded so well and where the League of Nations dismally failed. In this regard, Adlai Stevenson emphasizes that what the UN is experiencing in this crisis is growing pains. The United Nations, of course, evolves. It develops in small steps, and sometimes there are backward steps, and this is what we're suffering at the present time. Mentioning Adlai Stevenson prompts me to tell one of his favorite stories, which he says is true, which illustrates this slow pace of evolution of the United Nations. He says that one day he was talking to a delegate at the UN whose country controlled a colony out in the South Pacific. It was a colony in which the practice of the barbaric practice of cannibalism, not ritualistic cannibalism, but real cannibalism, persisted. And the country was trying to get rid of this practice. And this day the delegate said to Adlai Stevenson, we've had a breakthrough. We're making progress on doing away with cannibalism in the island now. And Stevenson said, yes, and how? And the delegate said to him, well, now you see, on Fridays, the natives are eating only fishermen. The UN progress is not infrequently like that. The fact that the United Nations is now in serious trouble in the way it is constitutes about as good evidence as there could be that the organization has been active, bold, and courageous, and in the interest of peace has never hesitated to intervene in the most severe controversies, as indeed it should. If it had followed a passive, timid course, its present trouble would not have arisen. But neither would it be very much worth saving. And during these 20 post-war years, the United Nations has not been content just to talk about and deplore local brush fire wars when they have occurred or have threatened. In most such instances, it has moved vigorously, expeditiously, and with remarkable effectiveness to put them out. I'm convinced that had the UN not acted in this way, the world would have been engulfed by nuclear war long ago. Naturally, the United Nations could not become involved in bitter controversies, such as those over Palestine, Kashmir, Suez, the Congo, Cyprus, without being exposed to emotional criticism and even hostility in some quarters. Well, now on this issue of Article 19, Senator George Aiken of Vermont, in a speech in the Senate on the 25th of March, would settle the issue by ignoring Article 19 henceforth, which he regards as good as dead in any event, and concentrating on making the United Nations solvent and increasingly effective, which is a good, sound, Yankee horse sense approach. And it's predicated on his assumption that the United States would never have actually paid itself any operation voted by the General Assembly which it disagreed with, which it did not favor. And also on the full assessment on the UN emergency force, which was voted by the General Assembly, the only peace operation voted by the General Assembly after a veto by France and the United Kingdom in the Security Council. But France refuses to pay for the Congo operation, which was voted in the Security Council, with France only abstaining. Soviet Union refuses to pay for either, though it voted 3 times for the Congo operation in the Security Council. One could find many inconsistencies in this picture. Well, I would like to have had some time to speak about our peace operations, but I know you have classes to get to, and I do want to say something about the civil rights issue. Let me say this on Article 19, that we have a committee of 33 now, which is working on this intensively, and we have confidence that in time this conflict will be worked out, the financial crisis will be settled, and the United Nations will emerge stronger than ever. Let me now conclude by referring to the question of human rights. The United Nations, naturally, stands strongly for human rights. The provisions of the Charter calling for equal rights of peoples. There's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which the late Eleanor Roosevelt contributed so greatly. And it follows inevitably that members of the UN watch closely developments in the U.S. with regard to civil rights. The United Nations does not officially concern itself with American problems of race and civil rights. There's the domestic jurisdiction clause in the Charter, Article 2, Paragraph 7, which prohibits interference in domestic affairs. But the sympathies of the members of the UN, with very few exceptions, are strongly with the cause and struggle of the American Negro. And this is not surprising, of course, since 2/3 of the population of the world is non-white, and the United Nations represents most of the world. Now, I'm personally confident about the ultimate outcome of the civil rights struggle. Despite prejudiced opposition of many white people and fear and complacency still of many Negroes in the North as well as the South, I have no doubt about how this struggle will work out. The American Negro will achieve full stature as a full-fledged citizen, will enjoy full equality, and move freely into the mainstream of American life. I mean by this completely, in education, in housing, and employment. And racial ghettos in our cities will have to go, of course. And I know that prejudice can be overcome. I've had some striking examples of this in my own experience. I'll just cite one of them before closing. A few years ago, I was invited, it was quite some years ago, 15 years ago, I guess, I was invited to the University of Arkansas. This was before things had begun to move very well in that state. And so when I was invited to come there to lecture, I accepted the lecture because I always considered myself something of a missionary on the UN and on the human rights issues, and when one's a missionary, he goes where the heathens are, naturally. And in my letter of acceptance, I said to them, I assume, of course, that the affairs and the audiences will be integrated. There will be no segregation and no exclusion. I got back a very prompt reply assuring me that this would be the case, and I went there and I spent 2 days at Fayetteville, right there below the Ozarks, and had a wonderful time. Everything was completely integrated, no strain. So I was quite unprepared for the remark made to me by the professor who was chairman of the lecture committee when he was taking me to the station to leave. And we'd got very palsy-walsy in those 2 days, and he said, on a first-name basis, he said, "Ralph, now that it's all over, I want to tell you how much trouble that letter of yours cost us." And I said, "What do you mean, trouble?" I said, "Everything went off fine here." He said, "Yes, I know, but a couple of days before you were due here, a faculty committee was reviewing the correspondence, and a member of the sociology department saw the assurance we'd given you about integrated audience. And when he saw that, he said, uh-oh, trouble." And we said, "What do you mean, trouble? Everybody will be admitted." He said, "Yes, but the University of Arkansas, don't you realize, is in such and such county. And in this county, there are only a handful of Negroes, and they're all sharecroppers. And they wouldn't come out to hear Booker Washington speak, much less Bunche. They wouldn't have any interest. And so he'll get here and see an all-white audience and feel that he's been tricked." And then they really got worried. And I said, "And so what did you do?" He said, "Well, we did the only thing we could do. We sent runners out over the mountains to Pine Bluffs and Little Rock to round up Negroes to come to integrate the audience." And I assured him that this was carrying democracy too bloody far. In American communities, north and south, there's still much distance to cover. I don't have to tell you that, much to be done. But in the simplest and also truest terms, the issue is whether the American Negro is to become an American citizen in full, without ifs, buts, and qualifications. Nothing less, I can assure you, can be acceptable, nor is there time anymore for gradual change. The change to full equality must come with the rapidity of revolution. For a social revolution is actually underway in this country, in this sphere. And that was very apparent in Alabama last month, I can assure you. Of course, one of the things, and this is particularly important to say, I believe, in a university community, is to do away with racial stereotypes, which persist in the minds of people throughout this society. And there's no excuse for racial stereotypes in a democratic society. We have experience with them in the United Nations. At the beginning of the UN, before we had a headquarters, we had offices. We had an office on Fifth Avenue, and we were staying at the Waldorf Hotel. And one day, early in our experience, Trimble called a meeting, and he said at 526. Well, this meant 526 Fifth Avenue at the office. But Victor Hu, the Chinese Assistant Secretary General, mistook it for 526 of the Waldorf. And so he went to 526 of the Waldorf, and as he tells it, the door opened, and there was a very attractive young lady in a negligee. And he thought that this was a strange receptionist for the UN. And so he just stood there and puzzled, and then she said, oh, pardon me, just a moment. And she left the door and soon came back with a bag of laundry, which she handed to the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. We never have been able to get the truth from Victor as to what he did with that bag of laundry. Finally, may I say that the right to vote is now the key issue in the Deep South. And in this regard, I feel bound to say a closing word about Selma. Developments in that tragic Alabama community have become one of the epic chapters in the entire history of the struggle for equal rights and status for Negro citizens. Selma made a dramatic impact on the American public, indeed on most of the world, in two respects particularly. Firstly, that as late as the year 1965, over a century after emancipation, in this leading free and democratic society of the world, a substantial number of American citizens in Alabama and elsewhere in the Deep South are arbitrarily denied their constitutional right to vote solely because of their color. And secondly, in the light of the shocking cynicism and prejudice of state and local officials in Alabama with regard to the rights and the plight of Negroes throughout the state, led, of course, by Governor George Wallace himself. The wanton brutality of state and local police, reported widely by the press of the world, and actually seen on TV screens by millions and millions, and the cold-blooded murders of Jimmy Lee Jackson, of the Reverend James Reed, and Mrs. Viola Liuzzo. There is, in effect, in Alabama, a reign of terror for Negroes and for any whites who sympathize with them on the level of a police state. And I was very sorry to read recently of some statements by former President Truman deriding the march from Selma and the leadership of Martin Luther King. I've long had the greatest admiration for Harry Truman, and particularly for his courageous contributions on civil rights as president. But I fear he has spoken from the hip again. What he has said certainly displayed appalling ignorance of the facts. Mr. Truman must have been dismayed, and I certainly hope he was, to receive that message of congratulations from Sheriff Jim Clark of Selma, Alabama. The American conscience has been aroused and quickened by the events of Selma. And there was a virtual pilgrimage to that place. I went there out of conscience, because my conscience told me I had to, and out of my concern as an American. I went there to march with aging and aching legs. As a matter of fact, I never liked to walk. I sort of always thought that legs became more or less obsolete with the invention of the wheel. And I would gladly take a taxi cab to the bathroom. But I marched there in a protest movement, at the same time carrying my own personal protest movement in those aching legs. There was an impressive cross-section of Americans there, both races and sexes, all ages and walks of life, and from all over the country, indeed from outside the country. I saw many Canadians. Just yesterday noon I was at lunch at the UN with Mr. Paul Martin, the Foreign Minister of Canada, and he told me that his daughter, the daughter of the Foreign Minister of Canada, had gone to Selma to march. A lot of people have asked, well, what purpose did it serve? What was the effect of it? Well, I can assure you the effect has been very great already, and it will continue to be great. I have no doubt that the President's message to Congress on voting would not have been delivered at the time it was, or with the force that it carried, if it had not been for the events of Selma. There would not today be any voting rights bill under urgent consideration in the Congress without the events of Selma. And Alabama, I can assure you of this, black as well as white, will never again be the same after that march. That march gave new encouragement, hope, and courage to Negro citizens in Alabama. Well, finally, we must all do all that we can to save the world by preserving the peace, and at the same time, we have the obligation to contribute toward making the world we seek to save a decent place for all decent people to live in. And that probably is the only way to save the world. The people of our day, all of us, have very, very much to do in behalf of our neighborhoods, our communities, our nations, and the world in general. There is abundant opportunity for every individual to identify and to usefully serve in one way or another, and in one place or another, toward achieving peace and decency in the world, and thus helping to save it, to save ourselves, and to save mankind's future. I thank you very much for your attentiveness and your patience in hearing me out.
We'll take about a 1-minute break to let those of you who want to go to classes late, go to classes late. And then, because Dr. Bunche has a luncheon engagement. We'll take about 10 to 15 minutes worth of questions. Those of you who wish to ask questions, we'd appreciate if you move as far forward as possible. Very good pictures, wasn't it? So we had to cut out a couple of pages.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know it on those pages. Well, we started a little late.
Yes, it was about quarter after.
Anytime you're ready, sir. Anytime. We'll just keep, I think, just about 12 minutes so we can get to lunch.
I'll let you stop it.
I'll stop it. I'll twist your arm.
Well,
Just to repeat the question, because sometimes it's just to repeat the question.
yes. All right. Would you want to take it, or shall I
I'll let
repeat
you.
it? Mr. Boxer suggests I repeat any question, but if you will, if you have any. Yes. The future of the Congo? The question is, what do I feel will be the future of the Congo? Well, it's hard to speculate. It's looking better, I must say. It's a most amazing place, really. It has a resilience that it's hard to describe. The civil war situation that broke out last summer after the UN force was withdrawn. We pulled out of there on June 30th. And it looked very bad for months, but that seems to be quieting down considerably now, and the area that's under the control of the rebels is much less, and the Congo may in time pull out all right. It's a rich country, you see, and it has that going for it. I should say a word, I suppose, in explanation of Mr. Shombe. A lot of people are saying, well, why did the UN change its position on Mr. Shombe? What's wrong with that is the question. The UN has not changed its position on Mr. Shombe. The UN did not oppose Mr. Shombe. The UN opposed the secession of Katanga, which Mr. Shombe was trying to bring about. We, in fact, always recognized and protected Mr. Shombe as president of the province of Katanga. But we were determined, under Security Council injunction, to preserve the territorial integrity of the Congo, and we did so by defeating the mercenary-led Katangese troops that were trying to bring about the secession of Katanga. Now Mr. Shombe has changed. Instead of being a secessionist in Katanga, Mr. Shombe is Prime Minister of the Congo and a very ardent nationalist. And he's fighting the secessionists and the rebels, and so his position has changed, not the UN's. Yes. Oh, if I had an answer to that, I'd rush to a phone and inform them in New York immediately, and I don't mean that facetiously. This is a maddening situation in Cyprus. A year ago, we went in there with a peace force with great reluctance and trepidation, actually, because we were putting a force down in the midst of a virulent civil war situation, not one involving only troops, but involving communities, the people, the civilians themselves fighting each other, Greek and Turkish Cypriots. It was as though you draw a line down the center of Los Angeles, And on one side would be one hostile community, on the other side another, with the houses and buildings all sandbagged as fortifications, and people with guns behind them shooting whatever moved on the other side. And we had to move in to this situation, interpose UN troops. Well, they've brought complete quiet to the island, or virtually complete quiet, so there are no more shooting incidents, but we have made no progress whatsoever toward a solution of the problem, a solution of the political problem. We're just about where we were a year ago. And that's the situation. I have no doubt that in time some sort of formula will be found to settle that situation. It's ridiculous that an island of the population of 600,000 should be indefinitely threatening the peace of the world. And so we will have to find a solution, but I must say in all frankness it is definitely not in sight yet. Yes, and I may say before this gentleman speaks that since I'm from the United Nations, I must say that ladies are entitled to speak too. We adhere to the principle in the UN of the equality of the sexes. We don't always practice it, but we preach it. Yes. Well, that's the question is why the U.S. has made such a strong commitment in South Vietnam when none of the allies have joined us. That's a part of our difficulty. As I indicated in my talk, it's not at all an enviable position to be in, to be the sole country guaranteeing the independence of a small country like South Vietnam. But this is an old story. As you know, it goes back 10 years. And we got into it, and we haven't found a way out of it. And now it's at its most dangerous phase in terms of the peace of the world. Yes? Would you stand up, please? So, the question is, what do I think is the best that the United States can get out of the Vietnamese situation? Well, I would think that the hope would be that by negotiation, by beginning of talks and putting it on the international level, some arrangement guaranteeing the security of both North and South Vietnam could be worked out with international guarantees as necessary, as in the case of the 1954 Geneva Agreement, which would then make it possible for the United States gradually to disengage, gradually and gracefully to disengage without any loss of face. That would be the hope, certainly, from negotiations. I have trouble seeing out there, and it's age that's attacking me. I see a lady, I think, which was, if I was right and there was a lady with a hand up, would she please? There, she did. Beg your pardon? Well, that's a good question. That's what the fightings in the UN is all about. It's not just Russia, of course. It's Russia, France, and 9 others. The regular assessments are all paid up. We never have any trouble about the payments on time of the regular assessments. The problem is these 2 outstanding special assessments having to do, as I said, with these 2 expensive peacekeeping operations, one in Gaza Sinai, the other in the Congo. The whole thing could be settled, as I said, for about $20 million. The Russians have agreed to make a voluntary contribution in which they would not say that this is paying up their arrears. They just make a voluntary contribution to the UN. In effect, they'd come and lay a bag of money on the table, which the Secretary General could pick up and apply it any place he pleases, and of course he would apply it to their arrears. The French have not gone this far. We were close to a settlement last winter in the Assembly when the Russians said they'd make this substantial voluntary contribution. But the U.S. wanted to know what the amount was beforehand, and so we got into which comes first, the chicken or the egg posture, with the Russians saying they would make the voluntary contribution, but the U.S. saying they wouldn't waive the application of Article 19 unless they found out somehow what the amount would be in advance. And this was what held up the whole 19th session of the General Assembly. But as I say, this committee of 33 is working now on formulas which would settle this issue. Yes? Get them from both sides. Well, just jump up. It's not a question of admittance of China to the United Nations. It's a question of who sits for China. And the state of China is a charter member of the UN. The issue in the UN is representation, a credentials question. Heretofore, as you know, the delegation of Chiang Kai-shek of Nationalist China has always been accepted. The Russians and others have pressed for the acceptance of the delegation of Communist China, of the People's Republic. The U.S. position has always been sustained by voting thus far, though by a decreasing majority. We don't know what will happen at the next vote, and the reason for that is that there has been one most significant change, and that is that France has switched from the nationalist Chinese to the Peking regime side. And no one knows at this stage how many votes, particularly French-speaking African votes, this French shift may influence. And it may be enough to mean at the next General Assembly the majority would be in favor of ceding the People's Republic of China, though personally I think that's doubtful. But it's getting much closer, that's certain. And one of the reasons for this is that there's a growing concern in the world now, particularly since the Chinese, the Communist Chinese, have shown an ability to develop a nuclear device and explode it, that somehow these 700 million Chinese on this vast mainland territory have to be brought into the international orbit, because otherwise the world will be very soon in extreme danger. With this population, 1/4 of the population of the world, being not subject at all to any international controls or restraints, and free to develop nuclear weapons without the limitations applying to all other states and people. And this is a factor influencing positions on this question. Well, I'm in your hands.
I'm sorry, it's my decision, so write letters to the editor. Sorry, thank you very much for coming.
This episode out sometime.